Ahem. All right, censor snobs. I hate to do it. I hate to take back everything good I said about the X-H2s. And so I'm not going to, because this camera's so good. I apologize for the clickbait headlines. It is YouTube, and I've got analytics. They tell me that the old algos like this kind of stuff, so what can I say? But I'm not totally clickbaiting you, because I do think there's a lot of people who should not buy this camera, and I think there's people who will be disappointed with this camera. I'm taking issue, though, with some of these negative reviews saying that the camera's bad or poorly thought out or there's something wrong with it because you didn't do your research and you're not thinking about who you are. So we had a little bit of a review drop yesterday or the day before. I'm going to keep this clean. I'm not trying to get into YouTube beefs, especially with channels much bigger than mine, but there was an angry review put out about the Fuji X-H2s, and wow, was there a lot of misinformation spewed. Also, I take serious issue with people reviewing gear not posting their work. If you think I'm an idiot and you don't think I have any talent at all with a camera, you might be right. But at least you can judge for yourself. You can go back through my YouTube and you can look at lots of examples of video and stills work I've done, and you can hear my experience and see what I've gotten. And then I hope that that helps quantify my findings so you can decide if they're relevant to you. But holy smokes, there are a lot of channels, including some really big channels, they give some tests and they look at a brick wall and take a picture of someone on a path. If that, there's some where they don't even do any of that. They just hold up the camera and show it to you. Wow, and then there's some channels that don't even do that. There's some channels that just give you reviews about specs they've read online. This stuff's blowing my mind. So this one particular negative review made a lot of really crazy accusations, and they're all wrong, and I have to say I've watched this channel for quite a while, on and off, not all the time, but when there's gear I was interested in. And in hindsight, I'm glad I never made any buying decisions off of it because it's just nonsense. So a couple of myths about the Fuji X-H2s, and then we'll get into like who should not buy this camera. So for one, cheaply made, you're nuts. This camera is not cheaply made. It does not feel like a toy. If you're on the fence and you want to buy this camera and you're thinking about it, tune out anyone who says this. And again, here's the thing. No professional channels, no channels of anyone making serious content with this camera have come out and said it looks like a toy. Yep, some people in comment sections or Facebook groups, might say, oh, I don't like the build quality or whatever. But again, show me your work. Show me what you're doing with it. Make real concerns about it and let's see and hear them. There are some design choices some people may not be happy with. So again, this particular review cited that you can't click in the dials and they don't like that. Well, Fuji has said that in the interest of weather sealing, that clicking in the dial was something they didn't think was necessary. They thought it undermined the weather sealing of the camera, so they decided to take that out. I'm happy with that. I did use the feature sometimes, but I often found a lot of times it got in the way. It wasn't something I necessarily needed. Same with the 150 to 600 lens. Some people have bemoaned the f8 aperture. Fuji has been quite open, saying that if they made it 5.6, it would have been, probably a pound and change heavier. So we're talking about a 25% weight reduction for one stop. Now, maybe you'd go the other way. Maybe you'd be happier with a heavier, faster lens, and I get that, but companies have to make R&D decisions and decide where to go, and I personally am happier with the f8 lens that's lighter for the way I shoot, and especially internal zoom and mechanisms, makes me happier. So I think, I have other things to mention here, but I think ultimately that segues into who should not buy this camera. Just look through it and see if the specs are what you're after, or see if it makes sense for what you shoot. This whole idea that Fuji has had trickery or there's been, bait and switch with the pricing or the features is just nonsense. They unveiled this camera alongside the X-H2 at the same time with two different sensors, and they clearly told you what the two sensors are. Now, I'm sorry if you're being a big baby about this and the X-H2 is actually the camera for you and you're upset that they're launching it 3 months later. I mean, okay, does that mean the X-H2s is a bad camera? Or does that just mean you're impatient and grouchy? If you were the CEO of a camera and you were about to unveil something that is exponentially higher and more sophisticated than any other models, would you come out with the cheaper, more accessible version first? Or would you unveil the flagship first and then let other models come out? Because if you're mad at Fuji for this, then you better send Canon some hate mail that the R7 and the R10 are, 2 years behind the R5. There's no logic to that. Fuji showed you in May of 2022 that they're coming out with 2 new cameras, and they showed you they're going to have all these new features and higher horsepower and way better autofocus, and they quite clearly stated one of them is the X-H2s and one is the X-H2, and they used R on the sensor for resolution. So you've got a 40 megapixel crop sensor body for resolution with a non-stacked sensor, and then the X-H2s stacked, so you're going to get the speed, the bursts, and all the other things that come along with that. In terms of value, this is probably the most affordable not even crop sensor, probably the most affordable stacked sensor out there I can think of, especially with these types of features. So no, I mean, I staunchly reject the notion that this is strictly a video camera. It is not. It's an amazing video camera, but the stills are very, very good. A lot of people keep complaining and saying, oh, well, it's not that much better than the X-T4. But what are you using it for? Are you taking portrait shots? Are you taking pictures of your pets? Are you taking pictures of little restaurants walking down back alleys on vacation? That's not what this camera is for. Fuji said this is a motion camera. That's why it can shoot 40 frames per second. That's why the autofocus is such a big deal. That's why the CF Express card is a big deal. That's why the stacked sensor is a big deal. This camera is made to shoot fast action, and those features also translate to being a very capable video camera, which, as per my previous video, that's where the PASM dial comes in. For me, anyway, being able to switch quickly between different modes and different resolutions and frame rates, all that stuff is great. Now, the funny thing is, there is a good chance that the X-H2 might end up being a better camera for me in the long run. I love the X-H2s. I have no plans to ever sell it or get rid of it. I'm not really an action photographer. I do occasionally shoot birds in flight, and it is nice sometimes to get that snap of a perfect moment. But truth be told, I've shot this thing in 15 frames per second almost exclusively since I got it, other than a couple of tests just to do some higher stuff. But I mean, I'm really not a guy that's into high-speed bursts. I like having it. I didn't want to wait a few more months for the X-H2. I had already sold my gear anticipating this new kit, so I feel very good with it. If I need a second body, would I buy a second X-H2s? Probably no. I think I would buy an X-H2 and have 2 bodies of, a little bit of redundancy, and have the option to either shoot higher megapixels if the frame is what I want with it, or something for higher speed. I think they're really going to be a really nice pair of bodies to give you a choice. I don't think that many people are going to need or even want to buy both, but you're going to have options there. So this particular angry video, what else did they say? They said if someone was going to spend $2,500, that they should buy a Nikon D850 over an X-H2s. Okay, as someone who owned a D850 very recently, I was shooting it with a 300 2.8 prime. The D850 is a very beautiful camera. There's a lot of things it does very nicely. Nice sensor, pretty good noise handling. Really like the ergonomics and the button programs, but this is how I know you're out of touch. The D850 is not in the same league as the X-H2s. I mean, forget video, even stills. Talk about bursts. Talk about shooting off a screen. And again, remember, I'm coming at this from the perspective of a wildlife photographer, but I very quickly moved on from the D850 because after having shot the R5 for a year, DSLR wasn't an option. I could not go back to something where I can't get at weird angles and shoot off the screen, where I'm in weird conditions and I'm trying not to disturb an animal and I take a picture. I don't want to have to move the camera, check sharpness. I need to be able to do that all through the EVF. Exposure, I'm not having it. The D850 is a workhorse. It's a stunning camera, but unless you're buying a used D850 at a crazy price and you already have a bunch of glass for it and you're very specifically going to use it for something that it's never going to stumble, you're not in the same realm. The autofocus, the power, the speed, the mirrorless benefits in general, the EVF resolution, everything on the X-H2s is going to destroy the D850 in 2022 for wildlife. He was also talking about how other channels are talking about the autofocus, how like the eye autofocus is a problem. You're nuts, man. The eye autofocus on this camera for people is pretty much flawless. And the funny thing is he actually quoted a fellow Canadian channel, Casey at Camera Conspiracies, and he said that Casey came to the same conclusion. I don't know how often this guy is on YouTube, but Casey just posted a video yesterday or 2 days ago where he vlogged with it and was very, very happy with the image quality, the ISO handling, and especially the autofocus. And yeah, Casey had some videos in pre-release where he tested it in the store and thought maybe it didn't track that much better than the X-T4. Those were pre-release, pre-firmware. Everybody knows that the pre-firmware camera had a few glitches and it was all fixed at shipping. So moot point, get out of here. What else do we have? Comparing it to the X-T4. This is a tricky one because I think there's a lot of X-T4 owners who should not buy an X-H2s. I repeat, a lot of X-T4 owners should not buy an X-H2s. Now, if you're here on my channel, you're probably a wildlife shooter. If that's the case, I would say the bird and mammal subject detection, eye tracking, if you've got the budget for it, I think it's probably nice enough to make the jump if you like to shoot that way. If you don't care about that, my good friend Matt tested the X-H2s quite a bit, and he's currently shooting an X-T2, and he's debating, does he put his money into an expensive lens or into an expensive body? And having shot the subject detection, he's more leaning towards maybe just buying an X-T4 and putting more money into glass. And I think his rationale is he spent so long using a joystick and putting his tracker where he wants to focus that he's not really comfortable using eye tracking. On the separate end, I've been shooting for a couple years. I spent a lot more time with eye tracking. That's how I like to shoot. I like to get it and compose and go with it, and I just much prefer that. So for me, shooting without that, I would upgrade to a camera that had a functioning eye tracking, subject tracking mode just for that alone. But I think if you're in a position where you find yourself not needing that, I would hold off because, excuse me, I do believe that the image quality on this camera is not that much better than the X-T4. But that's not a slight against the X-H2s. That's just props for the X-T4. The X-T4 had a great sensor. It had great low light handling. It was a really nice camera with a really nice sensor that's only 2 years old or something, 3 years old at best. So yeah, this is a new sensor, but no, it doesn't need to be multiple stops better than the X-T4. Even if it's one stop or a half stop better, I mean that's no one was complaining about image quality out of the X-T4. Again, nobody taking good pictures. So I don't think it's an issue that this camera is not delivering a noticeable difference to image quality. It's not about that. This camera is delivering huge advantages in autofocus, in burst speed, in frame rate, and in video features. So if those things are important to you, you should be buying this camera. If those things are not important to you, then you're probably waiting for an X-H2 or potentially an X-T5, or maybe you hang on to an X-T4 and wait for another gen because it's not an old busted camera. I was shooting an X-T3 for quite a while, and I didn't get the X-T4 because I didn't really think IBIS would matter. I was shooting stabilized lenses, wasn't really doing any video. And when I looked at it, I decided, the extra money for the X-T4 didn't seem like it would give me a lot of benefits over the X-T3 at the time, and that's how I made my choice. So I think in recapping this, I think I've hit all of my gripes that got me really triggered about this, but you need to ask yourself before you go shopping, do you need and want a stacked sensor speed camera? And I'm not saying that this is the only type of camera to buy. I'm not saying that if you don't like the way this camera is built, that you're an idiot or you're wrong. I'm saying don't buy the X-H2s wishing that it was a medium format camera, or don't buy it wishing that it was the X-H2 with a 40 megapixel camera. It's not. Those cameras are coming. If that's what you want, just wait and buy that. It made no business sense for Fuji not to release this camera first, and I have never seen a camera company, to my knowledge, release two cameras that would compete with each other so closely at the exact same time. So they were never going to release them on the same day, and they're never going to release the cheaper option first. This came out. The people who wanted to take the plunge took it. Everyone I know who I look at their photos and see things that I like really likes the camera. Doesn't mean we have no gripes. We're all mad about the ISO dial on the back. You could have a couple of comments and quibbles about different buttons and things maybe you would do different if you designed it. But the hate that people are getting, oh, it's overpriced, it can't compete, the sensor can't compete. I mean, I'm just going to lay it out here. You're probably a bad photographer. So prove me wrong. You're free to attack me in the comments here. But if you're going to tell me how wrong I am and how I'm dumb and the Fuji stinks and everything else is good, then show me your work. Ideally, show me your work with the X-H2s and show me where it's dropping the ball. Maybe even show me your settings, and let's see. Let's just hammer it out there and show the world and show what you can't do with this camera, because we've seen more than enough professionals put in results so far that are showing this is a very capable camera. It's by far the most capable APS-C camera that's ever been made. And in most metrics, it can stand toe-to-toe with the flagship full-frame cameras right now. Again, especially in wildlife. So know the camera you're buying. I think the X-H2 is going to be really interesting because if you're buying a 40 megapixel X-H2 with the intent on doing maybe landscapes or portraits or studio work, I'd be interested at that point to see what does it do that a GFX doesn't do, or what does it do that maybe a full frame option from Canon, Nikon, Sony doesn't do. I love Fuji. I think the X-H2 could be on my radar, but I'm going to be curious to see if you're using it for studio work, let's say, and all this fast wildlife tracking is not something you're using the camera for, then maybe that's where APS-C will still be a step behind a full-frame sensor. But out in the field for a rugged hybrid camera that can handle everything you throw at it, quickly, fast burst, fast autofocus, great weather sealing for $3,200 Canadian, $2,500 US, there's nothing else out there that does what this camera does. If you don't need or want what it does, just don't buy it. It's not the camera's fault, though.